My name is Dr. Ana Velasquez, and I've spent the last 15 years believing that some wounds never heal, that some losses carve holes in your soul so deep they become part of who you are. I thought I'd made peace with carrying that emptiness, the way you learn to walk with a limp after an injury that never quite mends. I was wrong. Some wounds aren't meant to heal until they've served their purpose. Some losses aren't permanent, just postponed. The call came at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning that had already tested my resolve. I'd been at the clinic since dawn, scrubbing blood from the surgery table where I'd lost a golden retriever the night before. 18 years old, died of cancer while his family held vigil in the waiting room. The same cancer that had taken my mother 6 months earlier. The same helpless feeling of watching something precious slip away despite everything modern medicine could offer. My hands were still raw from disinfectant when my phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Patterson, the head custodian at Lincoln Elementary, and she was crying. "Dr. Velasquez, there's a dog here. She just collapsed. Right in front of the school gates, where all the children walk through. The kids saw everything. She's breathing, but barely, and she won't move. It's like she came here to..." Her voice broke. "Like she came here to die." I should have told her to call animal control. I should have suggested the emergency clinic across town that specialized in trauma cases. But something in her voice, some quality of bewildered grief that mirrored my own, made me grab my emergency bag and head for the door. Maybe I needed to save something that day. Maybe I needed to feel useful again, to remember why I'd chosen this profession in the first place. The drive to Lincoln Elementary took 11 minutes through morning traffic that seemed determined to test my patience. By the time I arrived, a small crowd had gathered in the parking lot. Teachers shepherded groups of wide-eyed first graders away from the scene, their voices bright with false cheer as they tried to distract the children from whatever drama was unfolding near the school entrance. She was lying on the painted paw prints that led from the sidewalk to the front doors, as if she'd followed the path designed for children and simply run out of strength at the threshold. A brindle shepherd mix, maybe 40 pounds, with ribs showing through matted fur and paws that were cracked and bleeding from long miles on asphalt. Her eyes were closed, but I could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest, could hear the soft wheeze that suggested dehydration and exhaustion, rather than any acute injury. I approached slowly, my medical bag heavy in my left hand, speaking in the low, gentle tones I'd learned to use with frightened animals. "Hey there, Mama. What brings you to school today?" She didn't respond to my voice. Didn't even flicker an eyelid when I knelt beside her. But when I reached out to check her pulse, something made me stop. There was something around her neck. Not a collar, not a rope or chain, but something that seemed to be part of her skin itself. I gently parted the fur at her throat, expecting to find an embedded collar that had been left on too long, cutting into flesh as she grew. What I found instead defied every principle of veterinary medicine I'd ever learned. Fused with her skin, as if it had grown there rather than been placed there, was a small metal pendant. Tarnished silver, maybe an inch across, sealed shut like a locket that had been soldered closed. The metal had left a burn-shaped mark around it, a perfect circle of scar tissue that looked decades old, and etched into the surface, in letters so worn they were barely visible, was a single word: Mina. The world tilted sideways. My vision blurred, and I found myself sitting hard on the asphalt, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't hold them still. Because Mina wasn't just any name. It was the name of the dog my little sister Maria had loved more than anything else in the world. The dog that had disappeared 27 years ago. The morning after Maria was killed in a hit-and-run accident that had torn our family apart and left me carrying guilt I'd never learned how to set down. I was 15 when it happened, old enough to be responsible but young enough to believe that responsibility could prevent tragedy. Maria was only 7, with dark curls and eyes that sparkled with mischief, and she'd begged me to let her walk Mina to the corner store alone. "I'm old enough," she'd insisted. "Mina will protect me." I'd said yes because I was selfish, because I wanted to stay home and talk on the phone with a boy whose name I can't even remember now. An hour later, a police officer was at our door, hat in his hands, words that would echo in my nightmares for decades. The driver never stopped, never slowed down. Maria died instantly, they said, which was supposed to be a comfort but felt like another kind of cruelty. Mina had vanished during the chaos, slipped her leash, and disappeared into the maze of suburban streets. We searched for weeks, posted flyers, called every shelter in 3 counties. My parents couldn't handle losing both their daughter and her beloved dog, so eventually we stopped looking. We buried an empty collar with Maria and tried to pretend that some endings were final. Now, 27 years later, that name was staring back at me from the neck of a dying dog lying on the steps of an elementary school, surrounded by children the same age Maria had been when the world went dark. I broke down completely. Right there in the school parking lot, in front of teachers and parents and confused children, I fell to my knees and sobbed into the fur of a dog I'd never seen before, but somehow recognized. Mrs. Patterson knelt beside me, her hand on my shoulder, asking if I was okay, if I needed help, if someone should call another veterinarian. But I couldn't speak, couldn't explain that I was drowning in a grief I'd thought I'd learned to swim in. The dog stirred slightly at the sound of my tears. One brown eye opened, focused on my face with an intensity that made my breath catch. For just a moment, I saw something impossible. Recognition. The same slight tilt of the head I remembered from a photograph on my childhood dresser. The same faint white scar above the right eyebrow where Maria had accidentally dropped a toy on Mina's face. It couldn't be the same dog. It was physically impossible. But the heart doesn't operate according to the laws of physics, and my heart was screaming that the impossible was sitting right in front of me, breathing softly and watching me with eyes that held 30 years of secrets. I managed to get her into my van with help from 2 teachers, though she was dead weight, offering no assistance but no resistance either. During the drive back to my clinic, I found myself talking to her the way Maria used to, a steady stream of reassurance and observation about everything we passed. Look, there's the library where Maria learned to read. There's the park where you 2 used to chase squirrels. The dog's breathing seemed to deepen slightly, as if she were listening, as if these landmarks meant something to her too. At the clinic, I sedated her carefully and began a thorough examination. No microchip, which wasn't surprising given her apparent age. No obvious injuries beyond the wear and tear of a hard life on the streets. But that pendant around her neck presented a medical puzzle I'd never encountered. It wasn't just embedded in her skin. It had somehow fused with her tissue, as if her body had grown around it over decades. Removing it would require surgery that might kill her. And even then, I wasn't sure it was physically possible. X-rays revealed something else that made my hands shake as I held the films up to the light. Near the base of her neck, just below where the pendant rested, was a calcified formation I initially mistook for a tumor. But looking closer, I realized it was shaped like a shard of glass. A sliver of something sharp that had been in her body for so long it had become encased in bone, like the fragment of a car windshield perhaps, from an accident that had happened decades ago. I spent that first night in my office, sleeping fitfully in the chair beside her kennel. Every hour I'd wake and check on her, reassuring myself that she was still breathing, still fighting whatever battle had brought her to that school. Around 3 a.m, I woke to a soft sound I couldn't immediately identify. A gentle tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone knocking on a door. The dog was sitting up in her kennel, fully alert for the first time since I'd found her. She was tapping her paw against the metal bars, not frantically like an animal trying to escape, but gently, like she was trying to get my attention. When she saw me looking, she wagged her tail once, a single deliberate movement that seemed loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. "Mina," I whispered, and she tilted her head in response. The next morning, I drove to my storage unit across town and retrieved a box I hadn't opened in 15 years. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was a photograph I'd taken the week before Maria died. In it, my sister sat cross-legged on our back porch, her arms wrapped around a brindle shepherd mix with intelligent brown eyes and a white scar above her right eyebrow. The resemblance to the dog in my clinic was so strong it made my vision blur with tears. I brought the photograph to the kennel and held it up where the dog could see it. Her reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She whimpered once, a sound so full of longing and loss that I felt it resonate in my bones. Then she pressed her nose against the wire mesh, as close to the photograph as she could get, and closed her eyes. "God," I whispered to the empty clinic, "what are you trying to tell me?" The fluorescent lights flickered once, as if in response. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen around the clinic. The pendant around the dog's neck would be in a slightly different position each morning, though I was certain I hadn't touched it. A faint humming seemed to emanate from the walls whenever she barked, which wasn't often, but was always at precisely the same times, 7 a.m., noon, and 7 p.m. My assistant Jenny reported hearing children's laughter echoing from the X-ray room when she arrived early one morning, though no children had been in the building for days. I started dreaming about Maria again, but not the nightmares that had plagued me for years. These were different, softer somehow. In them, Maria and Mina were playing in our old backyard. But instead of the frantic energy I remembered from childhood, there was a sense of peace, of waiting. In the dreams, Mina would periodically stop playing and sit perfectly still, staring towards something beyond the frame of my vision, as if she were keeping watch over something precious. One evening, as I was doing paperwork in my office, I noticed something that made me drop my pen. Beneath the dog's fur, faint lines were becoming visible, like old tattoos bleeding through skin. They formed a pattern I recognized but couldn't quite place, something familiar that tugged at the edges of memory. It wasn't until I went home and found my mother's old journal, the one she'd kept during her final illness, that I understood what I was seeing. The symbol appearing on the dog's skin was identical to one my mother had drawn repeatedly in those last months, usually accompanied by the Spanish word protection. Protection. She'd never explained why she drew it, just said it was something her grandmother had taught her. A way of keeping loved ones close even when they couldn't be physically present. The appearance of that symbol on Mina's skin felt like a message, but I couldn't decipher its meaning. Was my mother trying to tell me something from beyond the grave? Was Maria somehow reaching across the years to communicate through this impossible dog who carried her pet's name and resemblance? I was a scientist, trained to believe in facts and evidence, but grief had opened doors in my mind that logic couldn't close. 3 weeks after I'd found her, on a Thursday evening when the clinic was officially closed but I was staying late to catch up on inventory, someone knocked on the front door. Through the glass, I could see a woman standing in the pool of light cast by our exterior lamp. She was middle-aged, dressed in a gray coat despite the warm evening, with hollow eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the world's sorrow. I opened the door cautiously. "We're closed, but if it's an emergency..." "I heard you found her," the woman said, her voice carrying an accent I couldn't place. "The dog with the pendant." My blood chilled. I hadn't told anyone about the pendant, hadn't posted anything online, or spoken to reporters about the unusual circumstances of Mina's rescue. "How did you know about that?" The woman didn't answer my question. Instead, she asked, "May I see her?" Against my better judgment, I led her to the kennel room. Mina, who had been sleeping peacefully, immediately stood and approached the front of her enclosure. The woman knelt and reached through the wire mesh to touch the pendant around Mina's neck. She whispered something in a language that sounded like Spanish, but older, more musical. Mina leaned into her touch, closed her eyes, and made a sound I'd never heard from her before. A soft rumbling that was part purr, part sigh. Then the woman stood, pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket, and handed it to me. "Some souls are borrowed for longer than others," she said. Then she turned and walked out of the clinic, disappearing into the night before I could ask her name or demand an explanation. I unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Inside, written in careful script, was a single sentence. "The pendant holds what was promised. When the promise is fulfilled, she can rest." I sat on the floor beside Mina's kennel that night, the mysterious note clutched in my hand, and for the first time in 27 years I talked to my sister. Not to her memory or her photograph, but to her directly, as if she were sitting beside me in the dark. I told her about the guilt I'd carried, about the way her death had shaped every decision I'd made since, about the loneliness that had driven me to dedicate my life to healing animals because I couldn't save her. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I should have walked with you. I should have been there." Mina shifted in her kennel, pressed her nose against the wire where my hand rested on the outside. For the first time since I'd found her, she seemed fully present, fully alive. She placed her paw over my fingers, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with her body temperature. It was the warmth of forgiveness, of love that transcends death, of connections that can't be broken by time or tragedy. We sat like that until dawn, and for the first time in decades, I felt something inside my chest unlock. The knot of grief that had lived there so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without its weight began, slowly, to loosen. Not disappearing, but transforming into something softer, something that felt like peace. As the sun rose, painting the kennel room in shades of gold and amber, something extraordinary happened. The pendant around Mina's neck began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, until it cast its own soft light. The metal grew warm, and the scar tissue around it seemed to soften, as if decades of fusion were suddenly reversible. And on the window of the clinic's front door, written in condensation that shouldn't have been there in the warm morning air, a single word appeared. Soon. I stood slowly, my legs stiff from sitting on the floor all night, and looked at Mina. She was staring toward the window, toward the rising sun, with an expression of peaceful anticipation. Whatever had brought her to that school, whatever impossible journey had led her to my clinic, was approaching its conclusion. But I realized, as I watched the pendant's glow pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, that this wasn't an ending. It was a transformation. The promise the mysterious woman had mentioned was being fulfilled, but not in the way I'd expected. Mina hadn't come to die at that school. She'd come to live, to complete a circle that had been broken 27 years ago, when a little girl and her dog were separated by tragedy. The pendant pulsed brighter, and I could swear I heard something impossible. The sound of a child's laughter, distant but clear, carried on a breeze that touched only my heart. Maria's laughter, the sound I'd thought was lost forever, preserved somehow in the metal fused to this miraculous dog's neck. "Thank you," I whispered, not sure if I was speaking to Mina, to Maria, to God, or to the mysterious forces that had orchestrated this impossible reunion. "Thank you for coming back." Mina wagged her tail once, looked directly into my eyes, and in that moment, I saw not just recognition, but completion. The circle was closing. The promise was being kept. And somewhere in the space between this world and the next, a little girl and her dog were finally, peacefully, together again. The pendant's glow intensified, filling the room with warm golden light that felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. And for the first time in 27 years, I knew with absolute certainty that some love really is stronger than death, that some bonds really can survive anything the world throws at them. This wasn't the end of Mina's story. It was the beginning of something new, something that would change not just my understanding of life and death, but my ability to carry hope instead of just grief, love instead of just loss.